Hello again, back in the Turnip28 hole, and this time having a look at what a townhouse would look like. So going for a kind of brutalism type thing, aiming to build a simple structure with plaster walls and a thatch roof. To begin with, I took some foam core and built out a template. I then trimmed the roof, so I'd have areas for the thatch on either side. Using hot glue to stick it all together. With the frame complete, I could then use that to gauge the size of the base. I also extended one side because I wanted a bit of a trash pit / garden. Then taking a knife, I beveled the edge and carved it around. I also carved a door frame at the top and the bottom, one for a balcony and the other for the base, using more hot glue to attach it together. To create a dry stone wall that would go around the garden thing, I took some underfloor insulation board, pinched off some pieces, then trimmed the edges to make them look a bit more natural. Then using a matte Mod Podge, I glued them down. For some flagstones and paving around the main building, I took some styrofoam and put a stone texture on it using a tinfoil ball. Then trimming it down into squares and rectangles, I glued them around the base to create some steps and a little placement for a shrine later on. I thought the balcony would be funnier if it was also a toilet, so I took some coffee stirrers and some bits of balsa wood and made a rough kind of balcony / toilet to sit above the piece, as that seems to be a kind of Turnip28 thing to do. I used matte Mod Podge to connect the wood pieces, and while trimming down some balsa wood, I also connected some timber beams to the top of the piece, so you could hang some chains or some rope off them later. To create a plaster effect, I took some slightly old polyfiller, mixed it with a bit of water, then applied it to the sides using a sculpting tool. By using a smaller tool like this, it also gave me a lot more control over the finish of the plaster, and made it look a little bit more true to scale within the world. To add some bulk to the base, I whipped up some sculptor mold and put it down, focusing mainly on the areas next to the wall, also leaving a hole directly underneath the toilet. While waiting for that to dry, I took some extra coffee stirrers and a few bits of the underfloor insulation and made a little shrine thing to sit on the back of the piece. To add some giant roots, I took some garden wire and a pair of round pliers and twisted it into a roughly arched shape with a few kinks in it. Then to make it look more natural and organic, I took some texture paste and applied a layer over the wire. Then using the same texture paste, I gave the same treatment to a polystyrene ball, so there'd be a kind of nexus for these roots to grow out of. Moving on to the roof, I wanted some thatch, so I took some fir trim from some costuming and trimmed it down using a pair of scissors, being careful to give it several layers so none of the hair gets too long. And sometimes this step gets lost later, but it's still probably worth doing. Once I finished giving it a haircut, I then applied a layer of black gesso, so it'd bulk up the fibres and firm it up. By now, the sculptor mold had fully dried, so I mixed out some texture paste, using fine sand, cork block, black gesso, and PVA glue, using a sculpting tool to apply it onto the ground. Before that had a chance to fully dry, I placed the root elements, consisting of the central bulb thing and the tendrils made out of wire. Then to add some waste elements, I took some random stuff that was on my desk, so little bits of balsa wood and coffee stirrers, and some little foam chunks. When that had fully dried, I then primed the entire piece using black gesso. Jumping back to the shrine, I took a little milliput blob and trimmed a hat of a Frenchman from a plastic kit to create a kind of potato effigy who would live in the shrine. Maybe he's a statue, maybe he's not. I don't think it really matters. I also had a few mushroom cones and some fungi looking things that I also had left over from the last time I used milliput, so I glued them down using matte Mod Podge, and jumped back to the painting, applying a layer of white paint over the plaster. For the earth sections, I took a burnt umber and applied that over the black primer. While I had the burnt umber out, I also painted the thatch. To finish off the ground layer, I took some tan paint and gave a heavy dry brush over the burnt umber layer. To add some greenery, I took some white paint, mixed it with green, then dabbed it into the pool underneath the toilet, as well as on the stonework, so you get a bit of algae and moss build up. To weather and stain the plaster, I took some green-brown paint, watered it down heavily, then just smeared it all over the base, as well as at the top underneath where the thatch roof would sit. I also streaked some underneath where the windows are, because in Turnip28, no one's allowed anything nice. To get some longer streaks, I loaded up the brush with water and let that do the work for me. Before putting the roof on, I added an extra bit of foam core to the centre to support it, then using hot glue to secure the thatch in place. With the painting in a pretty good place, I attached the shrine onto the back of the building. I had some water texture effect from Vallejo, so I dripped some of that into the pool underneath where the toilet was, and where I had left a divot in the sculptor mould. Moving back to the wooden beams on the roof, I put a dab of super glue and used that to attach a chain on the front and the back. To darken the chains down, I took some black paint from AK Interactive, watered it down, and applied a thin layer. Moving back to the garden, I wanted to add some foliage, so I mixed up a texture paste using some foam flock as well as some regular flock, mixing that with some PVA and applying it around the base. This was mainly so I could blend the kind of bulb thing into the base, as it still looked a bit too much like a polystyrene ball and I wanted it to be a bit more organic. I also took some lichen, also called reindeer moss, pulled a few bits off, and used some matte Mod Podge to attach that. I'm not 100% about the lichen yet, because it always looks a bit like lichen, but maybe it'll grow on me. I also noticed at this point that the water effect had dried with a kind of frosted finish, so I put some texture base on top of it, and put some other water effect gel on top instead. I also wanted to experiment with something, so I took some thin paper, and painted it green. While I waited for that to dry, I blended the foliage in using some watered down dark brown paint, alternating with undiluted green paint so I could build up some moss and step away from the brown palette a bit. I also painted the potato effigy, giving him a nice red hat. I also rusted up the chains using some brown paint to make it interactive, then designed, sculpted, 3D printed and painted up an entire new turnip regiment. You don't have to do that for the house though. Moving on to the best part, it was time for some tiny tufts. So these are tiny 6mm tufts from various suppliers, and I applied a few around the corners, carving up a few holes where the paint hadn't quite covered the sculptor mould, and just giving it a bit more colour and texture. Jumping back to the experiment, I took a leaf hole punch from Make Interactive, and punched out a bunch of green leaves. Then taking some dabs of matte Mod Podge, I placed multiple leaves overlapping, waiting for them to dry, then applying another layer of leaves on top of them in the middle. And the aim here was to create some low shrubberies and some leafy plants. With those last leafy bits dried, it was done. A nice, crusty and disgusting house for some Turnip28 goodness. But anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to catch you next time.